Hi, this is Andrew Sears, and I'm here with Angie Kreiner, and you're at week um, 5 of Nonprofit Human Resources. And this week is focused on addressing employee problems and separation. So that's a nice term for, employee termination or firing someone. Part of the reason why we focus a lot in this course on addressing employee problems is because a lot of our organizations are serving in at-risk communities, and part of their mission is they will work with people who might be higher risk. And sometimes you'll work with a graduate of a rescue mission program or a recovery program. And sometimes it works out great, and sometimes they relapse, sometimes they might have a mental illness episode, or sometimes they might just be a jerk. And so we want to give you some tools with that. Hopefully, all the other tools that we provided will help prevent this as much as possible. But the reality is, you can do everything you want, and some people are going to, have issues, and there might be some conflict that occurs. So, and what are the tools to handle that? So, Angie, why don't you start off with just how you approach these issues?
Okay, great. I think especially in ministries, it's really important to separate the difference between discipline and punishment. Most importantly, I think that there's a relational component that's attached to discipline versus punishment. When I write policies and handbooks relating to discipline, that word is very intentionally used. And the word actually comes from, I'm going to probably butcher the pronunciation, but disciples, the Latin word for pupil, which is the source of the word disciple. So that connotes a relationship with somebody in the process of learning and correction. And it also assumes that it's a valued relationship. Punishment is a penalty that must be paid when you're caught doing something bad or wrong. And the Latin root of punishment and its related verb punish is to punish, to correct, to take vengeance for, or to cause pain for some offense, especially in light of what Andrew just said, that we often are working in many ministries with program graduates or with people who have come out of really difficult circumstances in their past. Punishment it literally shuts down relationship. It is something that is done to somebody, and it's either it very much kind of backs people into a corner, so to speak. I think that especially in light of the fact that many organizations that are part of this and that work in ministries or rescue missions, et cetera, we intentionally take chances and hire and invest and work with people because we want to be part of that continued growth and development. We see in them, I think, what God sees in them, and that is that they have so much more than what they've been able to contribute or to show as of yet. And so really, when you come to corrective behavior with them, I think it's really important, again, to center that on discipline intentionally rather than punishment. They need to always understand what comes next, how to go about getting there. It can't just be, that's it, you're in trouble, go stand in the corner, put your nose in the corner, I'll let you know when you're out of timeout. There's no place to go with that. There's no growing. So as a reminder too, you don't have to go back to it, Andrew, but just as a reminder, Bible says over and over and over again in one form or another that the Lord disciplines who he loves, like a father does to a son. Um, and that discipline is done when you love or care about somebody. Punishment, that doesn't have to be part of it. So the pillars of effective feedback and correction are equity, ever more than, I don't know, it's just ever important. Equity in interactions, equity in feedback, equity in correction has to be a commitment to how we work. It has to be consistent across the board. It has to be fair to all people. What really we should be doing is setting the standard and then working with our people to get there. So it's got to be intentional. It has to be proactive. Documentation, I mentioned that before, and I'm going to say it again. It's critical. It's critical to the interactions. It's critical to work from. It can help to take out the personally charged aspect of corrective feedback because it gives you a common basis by which to look at and to work from. There's got to be follow-up and there's got to be follow-through. Those are two different things, and both of them are equally important. So. Generally, when discipline needs to occur, it's for one of three reasons. One is misconduct, and that is that the employee is doing something that they should not be doing. Or it's for poor performance, which is employees are often not doing something that they should be doing. And on occasion, there are issues around discipline because, number three, there is a misfit. There are times when we put people on the bus, but we put them on a seat that they don't belong in. And we are sometimes as responsible for that. And that is what I call a misfit. This person just flat out is in a position that they can't, they're not going to hit what needs to be hit in order to do it right, good, and well. And so when that's the case, all of these kind of require some slight different approaches to corrective action based on what the general foundational issue is.
Yeah, and I've found that 2 and 3 are often closely related, and often it's hard to really figure out, is it one or the other, you know? So if someone's not doing a good job, it may be that they hate what they're doing and they're not called to that, you know? Sometimes it may be a character issue, they just lack the work ethic. Sometimes it might be that they're not made for it. You know, like if I were doing an accounting job, I would not probably do a very good job at it because I'm not detail oriented. And, you know, part of what I've found is, you know, people actually think that most people are in jobs that fit who they are. I actually don't think that's true. I think most people aren't in jobs that fit who they are because, you know, most people don't understand themselves, and most employers don't know how to, you know, get people into the right seats on the bus. And so often I think it's worth just recognizing that those two are often interrelated, and it's kind of a discernment process. Um,
Right.
and, you know, yeah, often whenever I have to correct someone and I don't think it's going to work out, usually you know, my conclusion is it's not they're a bad person, it's there's not a fit for the job, you know? So it's
Right.
kind of
Right.
where I go. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that, along those lines, it's critical that employers have clear expectations and disciplinary standards. And just very practically, anytime you sit down with an employee over an issue, the employee has to know the nature of the issue and the problem. So maybe the nature of the issue is that they're 5 minutes late every day. Well, the reality is that in some positions, 5 minutes late matters tremendously, whereas in other positions in an organization, if you show up anytime between 8 and 8:30, that works fine. So they really have to know the nature of the problem and the issue. They have to know um, how it affects other things, how it affects their coworkers, how it affects other people's workload, how it affects the people they serve, how it affects any other affect that it has, which it always has some other affect. They need to understand that. Uh, I, I worked at an organization where the CFO kept what kind of people commonly called banker's hours. And he just wasn't that available. He liked to sleep in, so he often would come in at 10 or 11 in the morning, and then he would work until 7 at night because he could get more work done when there was less people around. And so to him, he felt like it was fine. Well, as the organization grew, and that was fine for a while because it was a small organization, but as the organization grew, people had a greater need to access him related to finance and budget across the board. And he had to change his hours. I mean, flat out, those hours became suddenly an issue. And the issue was that he was unavailable. People could not access him during the regular course of the business day, 8 to 4, which most commonly they needed to do. And so he needed to change it because of that. So employees have to know what must be done in order to correct the issue. That's an example of what I just said, a very fixable issue. It wasn't an issue. So sometimes an employee will say, well, I don't see what the problem is. This has been fine for all this time. True, but the nature of the organization has changed and people now need to access you during this time frame, and we need you to be here during this time frame. That's what has to be done to correct the issue. The employee has to have a reasonable period of time in which to fix the problem or the issue. Reasonable is somewhat subjective, and reasonable will vary based on what the issue is. In the example I just gave, a reasonable time period is within a couple of days. Honestly, it's like immediately, is there anything that would preclude you from changing your schedule this week? And if there is, then I'm going to need for you to resolve whatever that may be this week so that next week you're on the new schedule. In other circumstances, it may take more time. Going back to this example I gave where the individual employee needed to gain computer proficiency, that is going to take a reasonable time period, probably more like 6 months before we see something measurable, depending on the class and so forth. So reasonable is going to be circumstantially different. You need to consider that. The employee also has to understand the consequences of inaction or failure to correct. Now, along these lines, I would say this: don't say what you're not going to do. It is dangerous to say, failure to correct will result in separation of employment or termination of employment if you're not really going to do that. A more common thing to maybe say is that, if you fail to do this, we will need to take additional steps of corrective action because this is something that can't go unattended. So I'm not saying that you have to have a hard and fast consequence, but you need to make it clear that there will be follow-up and this has to get addressed, or eventually it could cost people their jobs. It is a little tricky because depending on the situation, that's going to vary. Like to your point, Andrew, with an individual who, took maybe 4 years before he really understood kind of appropriate interactions just because of his past, then there may be some more latitude of that and some more corrective feedback or tools that go into place. So if I'm working with someone who maybe loses their temper and they're working on their temper, but they still lose their temper, and to lose their temper in certain workplace environments is just not appropriate. One of the things I might want to talk with this person about is what else can you do? When you feel yourself getting that upset, what are some other things that you think you can do to alleviate that press in the immediacy of the situation? And if they can't come up with something, one of the common things is say to the other party, you need to talk about this later, but you need to go now and leave, physically leave. To leave is to better than to blow up. It doesn't solve it long term, but it creates an opportunity for the employee to, one, hit improvement in blowing up and losing their temper, and two, to say, I need some more help on knowing how to figure this out, or I've got to figure out how to really manage this better. So those are some general ideas. In providing feedback, you mentioned this in just a minute ago, Andrew. It's an issue. Is this an issue of character or competence? So when it came to number two, like employees are not doing something they're supposed to do. Say I expect John to provide for me a monthly report. So character or competence, does John have the ability to complete the report? Is he able to work the computer? Does he have all the statistics? Does he understand what's required? Does he have the template? Has he done it prior, etc.? If the answer to all that is yes, he has the competence to do it. So it's likely an issue of character, or he's just deciding not to. And if that's the case, then I need to know that. I may even start out by saying, John, why do you think you're not turning in these reports to me on time or completed as they're supposed to be? Talk to me about what's going on and what's missing here. For all I know, he may have a family member who's in the hospital, and so his time is different, or, sometimes there's other stuff at play. So it never hurts to even ask them why something isn't getting done or what they think is the cause of that. How is it affecting the employee's performance and that of their team and others? Again, you want to think this through before you talk to the employee because you want to be prepared to draw those connections. You want to also think through what kind of values alignment this is and where that comes back down to the foundational principles of operation. There's also an issue of can versus willing. The can, again, is competence. If this person has the ability to do something, but they're unwilling to do so, you really kind of need to get to the why. Because people who can do something and understand that it needs to be done, but just flat out don't do it, it's a much tougher fix. In America in general, so many people still end up losing their job because of attitude or attendance-based issues. They can totally do the job. They're exceedingly educated or prepared, but for whatever reason, they don't. And if you just don't often enough, either because you're not there enough to actually do it, or because when you are there, you're not focused on it, that will take a toll absolutely on your ability to get and keep your job. So when you address an employee, I think it's really important to have conversations and disciplinary conversations and actions privately. You don't want to confront them in front of other workers or their peers. Even if you are angry, refrain from reacting in a situation, but feel free to say, you know, John, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just go home for the day. I think that we all could use a break from this right now, and then why don't you and I plan to meet tomorrow morning at 9:30, and you
Now,
can just come on in then.
now, Angie, let me ask you a little bit about that, because one of the things that I have done also, so we have a staff that kind of plays an HR role, and I would bring her into those conversations, partly because I found early in my career that there's one time I had a conflict with someone, and the person basically completely lied about everything that happened in the conflict. And I realized, okay, I got to fire this person, but now I have a problem because they're misrepresenting the truth. And having a second person for protection. So what's your general advice? I mean, so in one, you don't want to do these things publicly. I mean, I've seen this happen in ministries where someone does something inappropriate in a group of, like, 10 people, and then they just get nuked by the leadership, and that's
Right,
not helpful, right?
right.
But what's your recommendation in terms of protecting yourself legally for high volatility encounters? Like if there's potential for high volatility, especially if you're dealing with an employee that there might be some risk around that. What's your recommendation for that?
Great question, because I should clarify that. Yeah, when it says don't confront employees in front of other workers, it basically means their peers. It is smart, if you are a manager, to include HR or to include another manager or your boss in certain employee conversations related to this, to any kind of correction. Most organizations, or many organizations, require that if it is a firing meeting, that HR and or the executive director or CEO, someone else at that level, sits in at that meeting. And I do definitely agree with that. I think that that's wise. I also am a huge fan of following up. So like in your case, Andrew, sometimes it's not practical to get someone else in there. Sometimes you need to be able to have a corrective conversation, just manager to employee, follow that up in writing. So follow that up in an email. Hey, I just want to follow up related to our meeting this afternoon. I brought the following issues of concern to your attention. We discussed what needed to occur, which includes these things. We're going to meet on this again in 10 days. You just want to follow it up very objectively in an email form and copy HR on that. So that can also help to create some protection around those conversations. It also helps to keep things on a less personalized basis. So in a meeting, like in the one you described, someone obviously took issue and decided to try to rewrite the occurrence. If you are in a habit of sending an email that very objectively covers what was addressed, what happened, what the issues are, when you're going to meet next, expectations, it takes it out of the personalization. And it also establishes you as a manager as this is how you handle things and this is how you document things, which means that when there's an anomaly like that with an individual, it stands out more because it's contrary to standard operating procedure. As much as possible, you want to, again, address the conduct as specifically as possible and relate it back to the appropriate policy, standard, requirement, et cetera. To say things like, you always cause trouble during team meetings means absolutely nothing to somebody. To say that, I'm not sure if you're aware, but some of the comments that you make, such as this comment during team meetings, it actually creates a bit of a divide among team members. I'm not sure if you've noticed that, but it actually curtails conversation and it makes people not feel very safe in expressing the things that they need to share or say during those meetings. So you want to try and make it more specific. always treat people with respect. Remember how we talked about we don't always have a choice about what we have to do as HR or managers, but we always have a choice about how we do it. So this is that. You want to always treat people with respect. You want to be truthful and kind. I've said to people many times, I know that what I'm saying to you may not be something that you want to hear or is fun to hear, but the truth is that if I don't say it for you, that I'm permitting you to believe that the way you're currently behaving is acceptable, and it's not. And it is causing some issues. I'm bringing this to your attention because I want you to have an opportunity now to make corrections if you choose to do so, because we value you here in this employment. So, to be able to say things to them like, look, I'm going to bring this to your attention and I'm going to do what I need to do to hold you accountable. But ultimately, the choice to correct or not is on you. What I don't want to do is for you to leave this place and to think that everything has been absolutely fine if in fact it hasn't. What you choose to do with that is up to you. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's great. And to your point too about gathering relevant information and facts, one of the things that I do, I do follow the principle of 0-1-0 in terms of conflict, but in terms of having to terminate an employee, usually what happens is, you can forgive someone, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a cumulative record, and you need to have a cumulative record that's well documented of whatever issues that it is. So usually I'll start to keep a log once I start to think I may need to terminate this person, or I may need to have, a better trail of corrective action.
Right.
And, they've switched from, grace still exists, but at the same time, grace isn't a permit to do whatever you want and you get to stay here forever. And all of a sudden, they are now a little bit coming under the law, and
Right.
they've moved outside of that zone because of how they've chosen to behave. So then I'll go to the employee, and usually what I'll do is I'll say, okay, there's these 6 offenses, and I have to figure out, is this going to be, I'm going to give them 2 more warnings or 1 more warning, or is this the last warning, and say, if this happens again, then you're going to be gone. But that way I'm coming to them with the history, and specific dates, specific details, and things along those lines. So
Right, right. And we definitely will get into some of those specifics, but you
yeah.
make a great point. Start keeping notes. And one of the practical things I do, and you have to decide what works for you, is maybe you've got a calendar, that your own personal calendar, that you just make notes like John was late again today by 10 minutes or 15 minutes, missed a team meeting, missed a client meeting, missed a whatever. Just start to make those notes because they do establish the pattern, and you're not relying just on your memory, which is tied to your emotion
Right.
about how to interpret this stuff. So it's very important. Different types of discipline that that are commonly used, and I do want to say that progressive discipline is relatively common, which connotes that you're going to start off kind of soft and move through these things progressively. The problem with progressive discipline a little bit is that people sometimes perceive that they're entitled to all of these steps in this order and that is the way it works. It's not the way it works. If you do have a policy and you do generally do progressive discipline, you want to make sure that there's a statement that says that whatever discipline is deemed to be appropriate and necessary by management is the type of discipline that will be utilized. So, corrective counseling, you kind of, it's a situation where you're like, well, maybe the employee isn't aware. Let's make sure the employee is aware of that this behavior is unacceptable, and or that the policy is this, and so this type of activity or behavior is not okay. So you have a conversation with that person that verifies that they know and they understand the expectation and the requirement. And you maybe just want to make a note. Hey, had a corrective conversation with Andrew today related to attendance. So that's about all that would be. It doesn't go to HR, doesn't require a signature. It's just a notation. You may still want to send an email, that says to the employee something along that. Thanks for your time today. I'm glad that we were able to reconcile, that we really do need you here every day by 7:55 to 8:04 or whatever the deal is. So Verbal correction, it doesn't require an employee signature when you actually are going to put something in writing, but it does require writing. So in this case, I would say, I've talked to Andrew a couple times about being late, but it continues to happen. And so I sat him down today and had more of a formal corrective verbal conversation with him. That I need to see this change. I need to see it change immediately, and I need for him to be on time on a regular basis. If something does arise that's going to prevent him, I need him to immediately call me, not to wait till he gets here to explain it. And he verbalized that he understands that, so that you've got some sort of written documentation that happened. You may want to do that again in an email communication to the employee, which serves the same purpose and also gives them that written account. A written correction does require an employee signature. It's a little more significant weight in terms of behavior or something that needs to be addressed. And so there's a written account of it. I think we do provide in the templates a sample. Some people though say, what if we don't have a template? You don't need one. Essentially, when it comes to written, it's basically what happened, why is it not okay, when did it happen, what's the expectation, and then something that says that the employee understands that this is an issue of significance and it's been brought to their attention. Signatures on those things don't always mean that an employee agrees with it. Not to be rude, we don't really care all the time if they agree with what we're choosing to address with them, because the standard is not going to be set by the individual employee. It has to be set by the organization. And there are some standards that are not negotiable. So the signature, if an employee says, I'm not going to sign it because I don't agree with it, you need to say, that's not the purpose of the signature. The signature indicates that it's been brought to your attention and you've been made aware of it. And if they say, well, I'm still not going to sign it, you can't obviously make someone sign it. You just make a note and say employee refused to sign, because that's what happened. And you file it with HR at that point. But you still follow up with the employee, in my opinion, and you say, following up our meeting and our written, I provided you with a written corrective action, and this is the expectation moving forward. Suspension is the most severe form of discipline, really short of dismissal. And it's commonly used when more severe violations have occurred, or when an investigation needs to happen, or when you've got to diffuse a volatile situation. And so you need to send somebody or to somebody's home immediately to get them out of the environment. Now, the big questions tend to be, do you suspend people with or without pay? First of all, laws are pretty clear on suspending salaried or exempt employees without pay. You really can't do that. I mean, there's very few situations where you can take a person who is an exempt employee and penalize them by withholding pay. So you want to be really careful before you just do that. You need to reach out to an HR consultant or an attorney to make sure you get good advice on that. If you are suspending a non-exempt or an hourly employee without pay, it's permitted, but you need to document it. And either way, you need to provide a written documentation that accompanies the suspension. In some cases, a suspension without pay may be subject to repayment if this is an investigative type of thing. So for example, a common one I'd say within a lot of rescue missions is there's a suspicion that somebody may be using again on the job. And so in that case, they are suspending somebody pending getting tested and getting the results of the test back. If the test comes back negative and the basis by which the person was suspended without pay turns out to not be the case, then that person should be restored to pay that they lost because that was a mistake. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's go
Okay.
on to the next one. A performance improvement plan is something that is used when you've addressed something before, but it's still not where it should be. And this is almost a kind of a heads up, like this is kind of our last ditch effort in order to get this circumstance resolved. because it has to get resolved or improved and hit a certain standard. And so far, nothing else has really worked. And so we need to let you know that we're officially placing you into a performance improvement plan. And if at the end of this plan, things are not where they should be and they don't remain where they should be, we're probably going to have to part ways, or we are going to have to part ways when it comes to employment. Like I said, the aforementioned things are not sequential. I tell people, I'm not entirely joking because this has happened many times. If you borrow the Mission van to go to Las Vegas for the weekend and then you return, don't expect a corrective counseling. You're going to get more than a corrective counseling. So it's got to be appropriate to the situation. When it comes to documentation, like I said, it's almost like you mentioned with performance appraisals. Getting some sort of documentation is the most critical thing. Whether or not it's on a form is irrelevant, honestly. What you want to focus on is the date, who, what, when, where, and then get it to HR. So the easiest way to often do this is in an email. And say you're writing to HR, you're writing to your executive director, and you say, hey, I need to make you aware of a circumstance that occurred. On this date, this person did this thing or didn't do this thing. This is the fourth time. I've already done these other things with this person to bring it to their attention. These other people were witnesses to the circumstance. And I'm planning on having a conversation with so-and-so about this, or I had a conversation with so-and-so about this, and this is where I anticipate, or this is what is going to happen next. This is where we are. And then that should go to HR. It needs to get filed.
Yeah. Okay.
Stick to the facts and what was observed. Again, you got to really take all the personalized irritation out of it. And because we are a primarily emotional workplace, that can be a little more challenging at times, but it's critical to do. Be concise, but be thorough. Be timely. I mean, this kind of documentation really needs to be submitted within 24 hours. You can find an hour to get it done, and you need to. It's important. If it's a repeat problem, you also need to include that in what's written and say, previous meetings with this employee on related subject matters include verbal on 9/24/20, et cetera, for whatever that is. Too often people get stuck because they believe that documentation has to be perfect. Again, it doesn't. A form is not going to fix it. In fact, most people that use a standard form deviate from it because most of the time it doesn't work for the situation. So we care more about getting the information, and that is the most important thing for the employee and for the organization than for you to get it all perfect. I don't want a weekend. I don't want a week. I want it in 24 hours. I think that's really it on that. The reality is, if you are in a management role or in an HR role, this is a critical requirement of your job. So this is an essential function. Giving some sort of corrective feedback is going to occur. So, and it's fundamental to accountability. Without it, what's the right word I want to use? It's unrealistic for us to think that employees will believe that they are doing anything other than that which is acceptable if we don't ever tell them that they're not. And we don't ever provide corrective instruction about what it needs to look like. You are not being nice or gracious to forego documenting issues and addressing employees. And I hear that a lot. I don't want to come down too hard on this person. They've had it tough, or they're mostly good if it just was for this one thing. Well, again, you're permitting them to behave in a way that is not going to be helpful for them and is not going to be helpful or beneficial to the ministry. So when you come back to being nice or gracious, those words kind of go right out the window, because the most gracious thing, the most loving thing, the most kind thing, and certainly the most equitable thing within an organization is to address it. Without documentation, you're more limited in your options, and you potentially incur liability for your organization. More and more organizations are not letting people just let somebody go. You can't fire somebody if you don't have any documentation, because it's negligent. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And it does create a greater opening for your organization to get sued. Because if you have nothing concrete that's been documented, letting somebody go is riskier business. I know a lot of people say, yeah, but we're at will. And we're going to talk a lot about at will employment. It's often misunderstood and misapplied. And just letting someone go under at will because you have no documentation is seldom executed correctly, and it still leaves some issues. All right, I definitely am a fan, like Andrew noted. I tend to say separation of employment because that is more accurate. On a minor thing, when you're looking through your organization's documents, details, policies, etc., it's a minor thing, but it's a major thing to me. You don't want to say that we terminate employees. We don't kill them. We're not the terminator. We don't end them. We end their employment. So we dismiss them, but we terminate their employment. So it's one of those things that just kind of always gets at me. If problems have not been corrected or previous disciplinary attempts have not worked well, or if the infraction itself warrants dismissal. And there are those that exist. I mean, it's not a, okay, let's talk about this. It's like, this is absolutely unacceptable and we can't continue in employment, period. Then you want to take the following steps. Take all of the related information that you have, all the documentation and all the information to the executive in charge and or HR, whoever you need to secure or approve a decision to dismiss the employee from employment. And then you want to work with HR to ensure that everything you have compiled is accurate and is full. Then determine an appropriate time and place to dismiss the employee. There's a lot of philosophies behind this. You know, you should dismiss them at the end of the day. You should dismiss them on a Friday or on a Thursday or on a, you know, right before their days off or et cetera. You need to think through all of that. There's not one entirely right answer to that, but you have to think through it. And here's your number 4. You want to make sure and have another management person or HR present. I don't advise that you have a firing meeting all on your own. And you want to plan in advance what you intend to say.
Yeah, Angie, one thing I'd add on the timing, I think what you're getting at is within a given week, like it might be better to do it on a Friday or something. But one thing I've seen that's often in ministries is people will know, especially ministries that are super under resourced and, the supervisor just doesn't have the energy. They're like, they know someone needs to be fired for like 3 months and then they don't do it. That's a problem. So, I mean, my general rule, and I heard this advice from a friend, he said, as soon as I know someone needs to be fired, I'm going to do it, right away. And,
Yep.
and I wasn't sure about that for the first year or two. And whenever I say right away, like within that week or something.
Right.
But I wasn't sure about that in the first year or two, and I didn't do it. And pretty much every time I didn't do it within the first week or two, I lived to regret it. The only other times that I've seen organizations do this is where they're in some sort of situation where firing that person is going to have some sort of catastrophic, effect on a program that's going to affect, clients or something in a way that, you got to get someone else in place. Like, you can't have a shelter unsupervised or something else like that. Then you got to work through the logistical things and get, you have to figure out how you're going to sort that out. But, it's important to recognize, don't, view this like, oh, I got to clean the house someday. And then, 6 months later, you haven't cleaned the house. So,
Right. I would remind you of hire slow, fire fast.
right. Yeah. Yeah. That
Yeah.
principle. Right.
And I would also say that, you're right, working in rescue missions, we do have those other counterbalances that we have to consider. But I would also say that if you've already decided that your shelter manager, for example, needs to be fired, you also have to ask yourself, what benefit is there really? The longer you keep them in that environment when you already know that they need to be fired, only creates or increases liability. You're better off immediately saying, who can we pull from current staff and leadership who can pinch hit until we get that position filled?
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. And I would agree. And, you know, I think that, and some of it also depends on what is the offense. Like if it's a safety issue, like that person's unsafe
yeah,
get them out right then. I mean,
immediately.
I've had people that I let go. I took their keys and I said, "You're leaving this moment."
Hmm.
And if, it was basically I was willing to have a police escort if needed. And then there's been other cases where, like if it's the case you kept talking about of like, okay, you've been late every day for, the past 6 months, and I told you couldn't. Well, do you need to fire him on Monday if you'd wait till Friday?
Right,
Like
right,
that's not a safety issue. It's just,
right. It's an
you,
irritation issue,
yeah,
but it's gotta,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Right. So.
All right, so the other things that are really important is you need to maintain control over the situation. If this isn't done, then an employee may think that they can control or change the outcome. So if you remember, number 5 said, plan in advance what you're gonna say. The meeting of separation is a definitive meeting. It's not a conversational meeting. It is, based on the choices that you've made related to your behavioral issues that we've discussed repeatedly over the last 6 months. We have made a decision that we are going to end employment effective today. Okay, it's a statement. It's not a conversation in terms of, hey, what do you think about this? It's still not resolved. By the way, we're going to fire you. If you start down that path, then it can get really messy. Obviously, to say maintain control over the situation, um, we don't control people all the time. People can common responses. They start to argue or defend. They try to convince you or negotiate that they can do something else. And if that happens, I think what you want to do is say, this decision has already been made. And so really it's not open to negotiation at this point. If they start to cry, you can say something like, I know that this probably isn't what you had hoped would occur. I'm hopeful though that you take this as something for in the future, because the choice to be on time repetitively, if we're going to keep it that same example, is ultimately up to you. And we're sorry to have to make this decision, but we're certain in the decision that's been made. So um, if things really begin to go left of center, if people begin to stand up and get upset and yell, end the meeting. If you were going to say 3 more things, but you can't get them out right there, right then, screaming over this person or squaring off in a defensive manner when an employee knows they're getting fired, they have very little to lose. So at this point, you want to de-escalate, and you can pick up whatever else you wanted to say in the back end of a letter or something else, but to say, um, we can send you the rest of the information. You'll have an email by the end of today, but obviously this is not going to be a meeting that we're going to continue. You're very upset, so we're going to go ahead and I'll walk you out now. And if they say, well, I need my stuff, just say, we'll you can set an appointment, we'll pack it up for you, and you can come on back and pick up your box. Just don't let people who are angry or out of control roam your building, roam around. I mean, you really need to work on getting them out at that point.
Yeah, Angie, to that point, one of my board members who's in a, large Christian organization, they said their policy was, as soon as you have that conversation, and I don't remember whether it was, right then, I'm pretty sure it was that day. They would never let anyone ever go beyond the day after that conversation, the employment termination conversation. They wouldn't say, okay, we're having the conversation on Monday and you can stay till Friday.
No.
Just because of the potential for rage and the lack of, they're like, what do I have to lose? I'm going to steal a bunch of stuff, or I'm going to badmouth
Right.
you to a bunch of employees, or, you know, um, and honestly, it's that last thing that's probably the biggest concern, because
Right.
most of the people that we have, like, I feel like, okay, there's enough trust that I'm not afraid that they're going to steal things, but anyone who gets fired probably feels like bad mouthing some people,
Right. Right.
so yeah.
Right. And I think that that's true. And I think that's an excellent principle. I mean, this is the last conversation and then they're gone. People sometimes feel like, well, can I go up and pack up my stuff? And in some cases, you may choose to let them do that, but they shouldn't ever be permitted to be alone. After this conversation occurs, if you want to have prearranged that someone is going to go up, like HR or manager is going to go up with them while they pack up their office, that's fine. But that's as close as it gets to them being able to leave on, quote, their own terms. Most of the time they're gone, you guys pack up their stuff, and then they can arrange to come back and get their box or their information from you. I know it feels kind of cold, but people need to understand that there are just some issues, that decisions that get made that aren't about them anymore. It's about protecting the environment. And if
Right.
you let someone, even who is emotional in that moment of getting fired and wants to badmouth, you are communicating a serious breach of common sense safety and protection to the people who are remaining your employees.
Right.
So okay. 8, bring all the applicable information. So when you have this meeting, if you're going to give them your final paycheck, which is the law in California, when you fire somebody in California, you must do so by handing them basically their last paycheck. So there is some additional preparation that has to get done. You want to check your state for final pay upon firing. It's different than if they resign, as opposed to you firing them. So you want to check that information. You want to let them know the date that the dismissal is effective. You want to let them know that COBRA information will be forthcoming, how long their current insurance will be in effect. For some organizations, health insurance remains in effect through the end of the month in which they separate employment. For other organizations, they sever it that day. So you want to provide that person with that information if you can, and then follow it up basically in writing, I think is important, because when people get fired, they don't hear or remember stuff particularly well. They're in a bit of shock. This is not a fun conversation. You need to collect all keys then and there, credit cards, identification badges, laptops, any other security sensitive or company property information. We already talked about boxing it up. I have had occasions, and this is going to become more of an issue, but as people work from home or remotely, sometimes the stuff that needs to be returned isn't at the physical work site. So that is something that your organization is going to need to think through. And it's kind of twofold. One is the physical return of the property, but the other is a discontinuance to access anything belonging to your organization. So this typically requires coordination and consultation with IT. So if you have someone who has access to client systems, donor systems, or other things from home working on a laptop, you need to make sure that during that meeting, their ability to access that information is cut off. So you stop or you forward the company email, you shut down their VPN or whatever else they use to remote in. So you've got to think about it both ways. And this is going to be increasingly common because we're now more comfortable working remotely than we were before March, and it's happening more often. So
Yeah.
some other considerations in advance of meeting with the employee is the final pay, and I just mentioned that. You've got to check on your state laws and make sure that you're current on that. Severance. Severance is a funny thing. It's not a requirement. It's not a law. It's not a mandate. I would never put a policy on it in your handbook because you don't want to make it this kind of assumed thing. And typically people who are fired don't get severance. However, there are times when an organization, like say a situation is just, it's complicated. They want to release somebody and they have reason to release them to separate employment, but they suspect that this person may bring a lawsuit, even if there's no reason for one, just to be contentious and difficult, which I hate to say happens, but it does happen. If you want to part ways with an employee and in exchange for some money, typically, you're asking them to sign that, they are they're saying that there's no outstanding issues, that this solves everything final pay, and they want to call it a separation agreement, and they're not going to sue you. You've got to be aware of federal law that is an older worker protection law. First of all, the federal law defines an older worker as someone who's 40 years old and older. If that's not a big slap in the chops, I don't know what is, but hey, it's most of our workforce, let's be honest. but it only applies to 40 and over. If you're under 40, your protections based on age are basically none. So a lot of people don't know that. But if you're 40 and older, the law says that if you want to say, here's a separation agreement, we want to part ways, we're going to do it immediately, we're going to pay you $5,000 in addition to your final pay. And in agreement, you agree that this concludes all of our business, that there is nothing outstanding, we owe you nothing, and you are not going to sue us for anything. And there is nothing of validity for us to be sued for. So if you want to ever provide any kind of exchange, like I will sign that in exchange of accepting this money, the law says you have to provide people who are 40 years old and older 21 days to consider that. You have to notify them of their legal rights and suggest that they consult an attorney. And from the point that they sign that document, they have 7 days to rescind their signature and change their mind. That complicates separating. So it's something that is important to know when you get there. IT and other notifications are kind of what I mentioned. You want to think through forwarding emails and to who those emails should be forwarded to. You want to make sure that they no longer have access to information. You want to pull them off your website if that needs to be the case, or any other contact lists. You just need to think through all of those parts and pieces. I want to bounce up to final pay because I said about state law for what final pay issuance is. In some states, vacation or PTO is also considered compensable upon separation. So there's a handful of states that do consider that. And if that's the case, you need to make sure and include it in their final pay. Okay.
Great.
Yeah. All right. Separation, you might know by now, I'm kind of a fan of checklists. So I definitely would use one when it comes to separation. And we have a sample of that, so I think we'll take a look at that. There's different types of separation. Resignation is anything that's employee initiated. Dismissal is when it's employer initiated, and retirement is exactly that most of the time. You want to include an effective date, whether or not someone's eligible for rehire, because you need to make that note internally at least, because you always want to think in terms of, if I'm not here to look at this document, someone needs to be able to clearly understand relevant pieces if this person comes back through. I have been part of a separation where an individual filed a fraudulent lawsuit against a rescue mission because he got his feelings hurt over a decision that in his mind didn't go the way he wanted it to. And we went all the way, it was an EEOC thing, went all the way through the end and arbitrated it, settled it, and because there was nothing there, it was an invalid claim. He asked if he could have his job back. And the answer was never, absolutely not. In fact, part of the agreement for separation was you will never apply to work for this ministry organization ever again. And that's all noted, that even though the nuts and bolts of the documents are not published, there is a notation with that person because he was so damaging to the organization for fraudulent purposes that the organization's like, we're not going to do this again. We're just not. So whether or not they're able to volunteer, especially in ministry organizations, a lot of people want to know if they can come back and volunteer. And this isn't even related to a firing, but say they resign, say you're a counselor and you resign, but you want to continue to be involved as a volunteer. Oftentimes it is beneficial and necessary to create an entire break, because the clients that the counselor may have worked with now need to form new connections with a new counselor in order to complete their program and continue to get personal counseling benefiting to their lives. If their same counselor is still free floating as a volunteer around the organization, they're not going to be as likely to form the necessary bond with a new counselor. And so sometimes there just is a standard of anyone who leaves direct programming, we ask that there be a period of 4 months before you're able to come and volunteer, so that we have an ability to set things clear for people who receive our services and there's not confusion for them. So you just want to talk through what that might look like, whether or not you're going to provide a reference and whether or not that's going to be in written form or by phone, and whether or not you want to conduct an exit interview. Exit interviews are a lot easier to conduct when you're not firing somebody.
Yeah. So Angie, I actually thought of a couple things that's worth covering. So before, whenever we talked about the exit process, we talked. I think we were basically assuming, a firing of someone where it's kind of I mean, generally any firing is going to be negative, right? But there's situations where you lay someone off, or in the past, we've had situations where it wasn't as much a layoff as like the job requirements changed over time,
Right,
and the person wasn't a fit anymore. In those cases, in both of those cases, we didn't follow this like, okay, you only have, the next 6 hours and then goodbye. We cared for the person in the process, and
right,
they still were a little bit, being laid off, you're still going to be a little bit resentful. In that case, I didn't follow, and I don't know what you think about this, but I didn't follow the, you're going to have to be gone, immediately. That person stayed, for several weeks or like a month or something, because I wanted them to have kind of to see it coming, essentially. So how do you
right,
recommend like layoffs or things where, a program, I mean, this is pretty common, a program might wind down, or,
right.
a program changes dramatically where, you now need a licensed counselor to lead that program. The person just doesn't have that, but
Mhm.
you like this person.
Right.
So how would you handle those type of situations?
First of all, a great question. I think that in your handbook, you should describe all the different types of separation. And one of the other ones that we didn't mention here under two, you're right, is a layoff. And a layoff means a separation, but not for cause. The employee did nothing wrong. It's like you said, things have changed. And so you've got a, loss of budget, loss of funding, whatever, job requirements change. In that case, you can do more of a planned transition or a planned exit. And that's perfectly fine to do, provided it makes sense and is beneficial all the way around. Some people, when they find out that that's the case, they don't want to stick around anymore. Other people appreciate like a month or 3 weeks so that they can begin. And I've done this before with people. I've said, we're going to keep you employed, but we're going to drop you down from 5 days a week to 3.5 days a week. And we're going to permit you to use that other time while you're still employed to actively job search and take interviews. We want the transition to be as smooth as possible for you. And again, this is a layoff. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just that circumstances outside of anything you have influence over have led to this decision. So you can absolutely do that. The immediacy is applicable when you're firing somebody for cause. You're firing them. It's a dismissal versus a
Right.
layoff or a mutual agreement sometimes. So
Yeah, and the other question I have actually related to two is the difference on, and you may cover this in another presentation, but the difference in unemployment claims, whether someone resigns versus whether they're, fired or laid off. So it's my understanding that pretty much across the country, if someone quits, then they're not going to be able to claim unemployment, but if they're fired or laid off, they can. Is that basically your understanding?
yeah, that's typically true. I will say unemployment is a state by state run
Right.
program, and
Okay.
it's kind of crazy. There are times where it defies logic or definition of how they're set up, but that is a general thing. So when an employer says, look, we'll give you the option to resign, that may mean we don't want to pay unemployment.
Right.
So other times, ministries, again, especially in a layoff, well, if it's a layoff, whatever, but if they say, if you want to say that you resigned so you don't have to say that you laid off, we're still going to pay your unemployment. We're not going to contest it.
Right.
So, all right, an exit interview. If you are able to do an exit interview, and like I said, when you fire somebody, don't plan on really doing an exit interview. That doesn't tend to happen. But it should be conducted by HR neutral party. So if you are the manager who has had this relationship with the employee and now the employee is leaving, you should not be the one to complete the whole of the exit interview, because part of the feedback in an exit interview when an employee leaves is the type of environment and management and supervision that they also received, because information gathered is supposed to be beneficial to the organization as a whole. Um, and so you want that employee feedback. You also need to talk about COBRA, which is the continuation of healthcare benefits. That is under federal law, and the employee has the right to continue it at their own expense to participate in their group health program if they were already participating in it. Part of the exit interview should also permit them, and again, this is not a firing, to collect their property or their belongings. You need to verify their personal information. You need to make sure that their hard address and their email address is accurate, because when it comes tax time and you need to send out those documents or other things, you want to make sure you know how to get a hold of them. And you want to make sure that you're ready at the interview related to any kind of final pay, severance, or anything else that you're going to discuss with them at that time. So I'm pretty sure, Andrew, don't we have a template on this too?
Yeah, we'll cover the templates in just a
Okay.
minute. I did have a couple kind of closing thoughts on the exit interview. One of the bits of advice I was given once was, if someone wants to say something nasty to you, let them say it before they go,
Yeah,
because and usually if people get fired, they want to say something. Sometimes they're not ready to do it, but I often will tell people, if you ever need to resolve conflict with me related to this, because I realize this is hurtful to you, then let me know. Part of the reason for that um, is unresolved conflict can be like poison, and often anyone you fire, it's almost like there's some poison there, right? So what I'm trying to do is to get them to discharge their poison before they leave, because
right.
if you don't, they're in relationship with people that in your organization, they're going to inject it into other people. And I can trace back histories of people that I had to fire, and then this person injected poison into 5 people right before they left. And the cost of that, I mean, a lot of the reason, part of it is, you said you have to explain the reasons why. So some of the reasons why have to do with legal, but my bigger concern about, like, how do you have a clear, quick, clean break, has more to do with this poison principle. Because we want to care for people. We're not just trying to, cover our butts legally. But at the same time, what happens is, if someone injects poison into 5 people, and I've had cases where I'm almost certain I wouldn't have had to let someone go had they not been, poisoned by this person right before that person left, then, they're causing a lot more harm. The other thing that I think is worth stating on the why, it can feel very cold to do these things. So it's not just doing these principles that we're saying, it's the how you do them. So you
Yep.
can do them and you can feel like, I am screwing you over and I don't care about you. And so how you do it is as important as what you do. So part of it is, I would communicate to someone like, I realize this is harsh, it feels really cold, and that's not why we're doing this. Why we're doing this is because we've worked with lots of organizations, and they've just learned that whenever it's time to end, it's time to end, and I have that conversation in a way, because what I don't want our students doing is taking these principles and then just applying them coldly, and then they get a lawsuit that they wouldn't have had they been nice whenever the person left. You know what I'm saying? Now, whenever I say nice, I mean, obviously there's no nice firing, but there's being compassionate, and there's doing it in a way that makes it less painful, right? So I think that's a point that I'd like to emphasize too. So
Yeah, and sometimes it is being direct in all that, but still being kind in the process. Like I had to address a female staff member who was maybe with the organization a year, and worked kind of on a resident assistant side, apparently engaged in a personal relationship with a gentleman who was a guest at the same of the ministry, um, which is a no-no. I mean, very
right,
clear
yeah,
policies.
right,
But, in today's social media and digital age, she decided to share pictures of them in bed.
yeah.
Well, now it's not surmising, there's actual documentation. So
Right.
the conversation went, we are disappointed that you chose to make this decision. You are aware of this policy. It's very clear. This is not something that we can permit you to remain employed in this role. It's a conflict. And at first, she said, well, that's not happening. And I was like, well, there's a picture. This, we're sorry that you made this choice. But it is something that now requires us to make a choice. So,
Yeah.
you know, we don't wish you ill. We sincerely hope that you learn from this, but understand that this is a decision that has to be made for this reason. So
Right. Yeah.
it's
Okay,
hard,
well,
but yeah,
let's jump into the template. So this week, we have just a couple templates, and we may add some more later, but we have a sample disciplinary notice that you would give someone. So this is, what Angie was referring to, where you provide the documentation, and then this would be, the next level where you're requiring, some sort of signature, um, and and I honestly, the most important part of this, I think, that you might want to copy is this. My signature indicates that the
yeah,
above has been discussed with me, and I have been given opportunity to ask questions and comments. Because a lot of what you don't want to say is I agree with everything above, because anytime you're conflicting with someone, then they're going to use that as a power play with you. So you don't want to, give them that opportunity. And then this is the form that you use, and I think, is there a checklist in here? Well, I guess it kind of serves as a checklist,
there it
for
is.
all these
Yeah,
things.
that's
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah. So this is helpful to just make sure that, and you could modify this,
Yeah.
um, for your organization. So,
Ooh, I just thought of one thing I wanted to say.
okay.
Most of the time when I write policies around separation, one thing that I include that you may want to consider is that if an employee gives resignation verbally and then wants to rescind it, that can only be rescinded at the discretion of HR and or leadership and management. And I'll tell you why, because we deal again with highly volatile and emotional people in general. So sometimes we pray people out. But I
Right.
mean, there are people that we they're not making it, and we just, it's a matter of prayer sometimes. And so what happens is, I've had this happen. So uh, the person becomes upset in a situation and they quit. I quit. I've had it. Okay, guess what? Problem solved. Sometimes that does solve it. You don't have to fire them. They just quit. The next day, the person comes back to work as if nothing happened. And when the executive director says, "What are you doing here? You quit yesterday." And they say, "I didn't mean that." Okay, if you have written the policy in your handbook that if someone issues resignation or quit, whatever, if they quit their job, even if it's verbal, the only way that that can be rescinded is at the discretion of the employer. It gives you a level of protection around that, because I'd like to say it only happens once, but it does happen. And so that's something that's just worth considering, when you're looking at related policies.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to cover next week. We're going to go into a lot more of the legal issues. We're going to cover a lot of the policies to think about, and having all these things in your personnel manual or your employee manual in your organization can save you a lot of trouble, because what I've found is if you don't have it in the manual, and then it becomes personal, and then they get mad at you. But if it's in the manual, then you can say, you know what, we're just going to follow what's in the manual. Let's look up, and often I know what the policy is, and I say, hey, let's look up the policy, and then they see, oh, here's what it is. So that way they're like, oh, that is what the rule is, right? So, and I think that can help a lot. So, okay, well, Angie, thanks a lot, and
Thank you.
yeah, I appreciate it.